It is difficult to understand how a periodical which received mixed reviews, provided little original content, and catered almost exclusively to an esoteric market lasted for more than 45 years. How could a magazine produced by university intelligentsia for high-minded people last in a market characterized by literary and didactic periodicals? How could a publication which was modeled on foreign periodical concepts, which focused on primarily reviews and scholarship, survive the various changes of the English publishing market for half a century? Somehow, the Academy managed not only to stay afloat in this market, but it also found moderate success for a journal of its nature. The Academy was first published on October 9, 1869. From the start, it upheld and propagated liberal views which emanated from Oxford University, and it was modeled on the Continental Reviews which were popular in France and Germany at that time. It was, as Bourne explains, quote, a journal which should systematically survey the European literary and scientific movement as a whole, and pass judgment upon books not from an insular, still less from a partisan, but from a cosmopolitan point of view. It tried to maintain objectivity as much as it could, and it was preoccupied with its intellectual interests. As for the cosmopolitan perspective, this aspect is debatable. The Academy did not reach the widest of audiences despite its success. Nevertheless, it battled through low sales, persistent academic scrutiny, questions of relevance, and economic and social challenges to become a truly unique magazine which carved its own path. At its core, the Academy was inspired by the political, social, and cultural views set forth by Oxfordians like Charles Appleton and Matthew Arnold, which meant that it was less concerned with sales and success than it was with producing strong scholarly content. This stance immediately became problematic. Charles Appleton was an Oxford Don who is now best known for his work with the Academy, which he founded and which he edited from 1869 until 1879. He was more interested in the journal's intellectual contents than the business demands which came with running a magazine. As a result, Appleton resisted advertisements despite the economic benefits of them. Reasons for this resistance are unclear, but they point to the ongoing struggle between the project's academic integrity and its subsistence. The problem culminated in strife with the journal's publisher, John Murray, who lasted 11 months before relinquishing his duties. Murray, by all accounts, appreciated the venture, but he understood that the Academy could not be financially viable without ad sales. Regardless, intellectual content was the periodical's core, and it resisted giving into these pressures until it became absolutely necessary. It clung to its values mercilessly, preserving its anti-Philistine stance despite the economic realities that the journal faced. Anti-Philistinism derives largely from Matthew Arnold's Culture and Anarchy, an essay in political and social criticism, which was also published in 1869. It advocates pursuing perfection by engaging with, quote, the best which has been thought and said. It advocates, quote, the harmonious expansion of all the powers which make the beauty and worth of human nature, and the rejection of what Arnold calls Philistine principles, which favor materialism over beauty, art, and the intellect. While this definition is a simplified version of a complex discussion which Arnold presents, these basic ideas provide a background for the Academy's central values. Despite early struggles, Appleton stayed the course and the magazine slowly grew. Appleton, Oxford's leader in the reform group, persevered until the concept of a review magazine became viable. Over time, the Academy developed a model which reviewed the best works across numerous fields. Its novel reviewers were the best in the field and came with respective credentials. Their work was particularly important because novel literature was not a staple in many academic communities at this time. The transition was slow, and the Academy's reviewers contributed to the movement's progress. Together, they allowed the Academy to grow into its role as the first review magazine to include signed reviews. Matthew Arnold, who we have already discussed, is said to have contributed to the magazine. He was an Oxford academic and inspector of schools, and is known as one of the primary social commentators of the Victorian period. Edith Simcox is one of the most notable reviewers who contributed to the journal. Simcox had family ties to Oxford, and she was a highly intellectual woman herself. She knew a host of languages, philosophy, and was well versed in contemporary politics. She served on school boards, trade unions, and she wrote for all the major London publications. She was a socialist at heart and in her politics, denouncing capitalism, individualism, and in short, Philistinism. She was a natural fit with the Academy. Edmund Goes, the Victorian writer, was also heavily involved with the Academy's reviews. He struggled somewhat as a writer and did not achieve high sales initially. However, he found his niche in writing biography and criticism. His fiction was substandard, but his writing about fiction was excellent. He became the librarian at the House of Lords and one of England's more powerful writers at the turn of the century. He sat on boards for the Nobel Prize, the London Library, and the Anglo-French Society. At times he was said to be out of touch with current trends and was even viciously critiqued for his work, especially in his later years. Nevertheless, his credentials remained strong, he remained trusted, and he contributed much to the Academy. Arnold Bennett also contributed much to the literary scene at the turn of the century. He wrote profusely in his early adult life, and he carved a path for himself through various newspaper and magazine articles. He then moved on to publish novels, and he edited the periodical called Woman in the 1890s. He grew in notoriety and became one of the highest-paid writers of his day. His later years were less successful, professionally and personally, and he was deeply affected by the First World War. However, this does not diminish the fact that he was one of the top writers of his day and contributed well to the Academy. Many times throughout its life, the Academy followed a pattern where it would rise from its struggles only to fall into new ones 10 years later. It would then adapt, alter its focus slightly, and then find success once again. Being able to adapt and mature allowed the Academy to sustain itself, however precarious its existence was at times. It frequently changed ownership and editorship. After 10 years under Appleton's governance, the magazine moved on to Mark Patteson, who promptly hired James Sutherland Cotton. Cotton was editor from 1881 to 1896, and he bought into the magazine's structure. His most notable contribution is the one which got him a job with the Academy in the first place. His 4,000-word review of the Oxford English Dictionary was a boon for the periodical and began what was, on the whole, a successful tenure with the Academy for Cotton. After Patteson and Cotton, the Academy's lack of stability is evident. Over the next decade, numerous editors tried to support the magazine's scope and goals, but most were unsuccessful. Charles Lewis Hind, Cowper, and the Crossland Savage brothers all tried to sustain the Academy in some way, but most could not curb the drop in sales. The Academy sold 16,000 copies per month in 1869-1870, and probably experienced similar numbers for some time beyond this. Most critics agree that these numbers fluctuated as the years progressed, but there was a general downward trend in the market during this time. Because it catered to an intellectual community, its scope was limited right from the start. Although there were attempts to broaden its horizons by accommodating more philosophical and scientific interests, this did not work. When John Morgan Richards, an American, purchased the magazine in 1896, it became less Oxfordian and had a stronger financial backing. But this did not increase the sales significantly. Once they began to decline, the periodical's descent was gradual but steady. Lord Alfred Douglas edited the periodical from 1907 to 1910, and during this time it saw a bit of a renaissance. Douglas was able to restore some of its integrity and reputation in the academic community. However, Douglas had his other ventures and his own personal demons stemming from his turbulent relationship with Oscar Wilde in the 1890s and with his wife and their child. Once he left the Academy, it was only a matter of time before it ceased publication. It finally did so in 1916. Defining the periodical is difficult because it occupied a strange space between the literary periodical and a scholarly publication. At its worst, the Academy was a high-minded magazine which catered exclusively to intellectual interests. It could not generate large sales because it could not accommodate wider readerships. It struggled to balance its Philistine principles with the economic demands and realities associated with running a magazine. At its best, the Academy was a model publication which preserved its intellectual integrity and appealed to the top academics. It provided valuable insight into the academic publishing world. It supplied high-quality reviews by the top reviewers and intellectual minds of the day. It bridged a gap between the literary and the academic communities at a time when novels were not a staple in many academic institutions. It gave intellectuals a space of their own. According to Hurd, the Academy was a quality, critical, and literary magazine which had moments of brilliance. I will not summarize this title by saying that it fell somewhere in between these two extremes. In fact, such an assertion would be erroneous. It seemed to encompass these two extremes simultaneously. Even at its peak reputation, it suffered from its intellectual and financial detractions. It constantly struggled to reinvent itself, seemingly having to do so just as it gained ground again. Its existence was precarious, but 45 to 50 years of consistent publication cannot be discounted. It persevered, it remained intellectual, and it occupied its own niche. It's hard to argue against that. To put it another way, if someone told Appleton and the Anti-Philistines that they could begin a journal which lasted for almost half a century without forfeiting its intellectual focus or many of its values, that they would not achieve much financial success, but they would become reputable across numerous fields of inquiry, and that they would have a publication which occupied its own market in a crazy Philistine publishing world, they would probably jump at the opportunity to begin. Thanks for listening.